Well, welcome to a conversation with Bill Kirby and his new book, Empires of Ideas, Creating the Modern University from Germany to America to China. We're really thrilled to have him here. He's a visiting scholar for a period, which he was before when he was working on this book. So congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
Bill is quite a impressive array of thinking about the topic. And also great case studies, which Bill will probably mention some of. To begin with, I just want to make sure that people know who Bill is. He's the T.M. Chang Professor of Chinese Studies at Harvard University and Spangler Family Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School. He's also holds a University Distinguished Service Professorship. And he serves as chairman of the Harvard China Fund and a faculty chair of the Harvard Center Shanghai. He served previously as the director of the Fairbank Center for Chinese Studies at Harvard and was chairman of the history department and dean of the faculty of arts and sciences at Harvard. So quite an impressive array of titles and jobs that he's had to navigate through. His last book was Can China Lead? And this is his new book, and he's working on another one while he's working here, but we're going to focus first on Empires of Ideas. So I'm going to ask a question, he's going to answer, he'll give an intro to the book a little bit, and then we'll go to some questions that I've collected from the registered people for this event. And I have a few questions, and then I'll try to look at the chat and see what questions you come up with. So please keep that in mind. As we get about halfway through, I'll start looking at the screen and see what kind of questions we have from our audience. So Bill, my first question is, why did you write this book?
I wrote this book. It actually came to the idea of looking at the trajectory of universities and systems of universities. First occurred to me when in 2010 I was in Berlin and I was invited to the 200th anniversary of the Humboldt University, the mother of all research universities, from which we all stem in some sense or other. And the then president of the Humboldt University welcomed us all with these words. He said, "Nobody would take my university as a model for anything today." He was very quickly no longer the president of the Humboldt University.
I was at that event too.
You remember that. It was an amazing speech. And I thought, holy moly. And I knew a lot about American universities from my time as dean of FAS and our the peers of Harvard and others such as Berkeley. But I began to think of the kind of history of the modern research university. And as a China historian, I've been watching, as we all have, the rise of China, including the revival of Chinese universities in the 21st century. And so I began to think, if Germany could lead the 19th century, and if the United States obviously had a great 20th century in higher education, what are the prospects for Chinese leadership? But it began back then. I didn't start the research back then. Started it here in this center, maybe 6 years ago, 7 years ago, in a serious way.
Fantastic. So now you have a short presentation he has?
I do. So let me just quickly, that's the cover of the book that John has shown you. And now we're not advancing. See if you can get it onto straight slideshow. Well, it's a story that begins in Berlin. I'll just, every time I do this, just keep going. And it begins with this gentleman, Wilhelm von Humboldt, who creates the first dedicated research university and sets out in motion almost so many things that we take for granted today. Next. But it sets out in motion, this was the greatest university in the world as late as 1930. But as you can see here, with the National Socialist takeover, and then with the division of Berlin into East and West, the Humboldt University, as it becomes known in the German Democratic Republic, declines rather precipitously. Higher education declines. There is, in the next slide, the Free University, Free University of Berlin, here with President Kennedy in 1963, and I was a student there at this time. But the very point here, is the next slide will show, this great university, the mother of all universities, research universities, is today not even the best university in Germany, Göttingen in or even in Bergen, Göttingen in the entire world. This brings us to North America, to a place that I know well, Harvard, if you go to the next, a place that becomes a decent university only under the leadership several hundred years, 250 years into its history, under the leadership of Charles Eliot, who imports a German model of education following Hopkins in Chicago, and founds the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, and it becomes a serious research university in the sciences only in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. This great university where I am today is, of course, the greatest, in my view, public university in the United States and the centerpiece of the greatest system of higher education in the world. And when I was here last time, and we'll just quickly go through these pictures, Gemma, I studied with John the great work of the system under Clark Kerr. Next. Worried about the amount of state funding going into the beautiful California Memorial Stadium, where the Golden Bears are actually not having a great year. Next. Nobel laureates at Berkeley used to get a building, then they got a lab. Today, a parking space. Next. There was a global campus to be built, still lying fallow in Richmond, not far from here. Many challenges to this great public university, and controversies, as the next slide will show, even over such things as a simple fence around the chancellor's residence. But the key point of Berkeley, and this is of course still a great university, is that it is in one of the 44 out of 50 American states that are disinvesting in public higher education. And this is a warning sign for the United States. If we go to the next, we see Duke University, which I argue is the fastest rising university in the United States, one that more consistently than others plans assiduously for its future, and is in many ways, as the next slide will show, the most international of American universities, here with its liberal arts college in Kunshan outside of Shanghai, a project that I assisted the Duke's president in starting. This brings us to China. Very quickly, Peking University at its beginning as Yenjing University, next. A place that has caused problems for governments since at least 1919. Here's the May 4th demonstration of a small number of Peking University students that nearly brought down a government. Next. One of a series of extraordinary institutions. This is National Central University, founded by Chiang Kai-shek in the 1930s, that is modeled on the University of Berlin with the Brandenburg Gate to welcome you into it. Next, please. Another gate here into Tsinghua University, and from the next slide you can see modeled on an American Midwestern college. Here, the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign becomes China's greatest research university, as the next slide might indicate, and one dedicated to academic freedom, with this motto, which you can read here, of 独立之精神，自由之思想, of spirits independent and minds unfettered. And the next slide, a place that by the 1960s looks and 70s looks less like Urbana-Champaign and more like Moscow State. Here during the Cultural Revolution, still some people graduating, as the next slide will indicate. Mr. Xi Jinping getting his degree here in 1977. And today, as the next slide shows, Tsinghua University, founded back in 1911 as a place to send Chinese, a prep school to send Chinese to the United States, becomes a great comprehensive university. Today, in this college, Sushimin Shuyuan, Schwartzman College at Tsinghua University, wants to bring the best and the brightest of the world to Beijing, to be the Rhodes Scholarship of the 21st century. So you see a revival and now rise, as the next slide will show, of Chinese universities. Rankings, here's Peking University, number 12, Tsinghua University, number 14 in the QS rankings. You know where Yale University is, John?
I'll say 18.
Exactly right. Way below. Okay, it seems just right from Harvard's perspective. And the question to be asked, as the next slide has, how is it that China can't meet this way. Well, let me just end with this thought and this next picture. This is the central reason why China may not lead. The challenge of the Communist Party, one that has funded these universities with great generosity through its state apparatuses, but one that still has outside the walls of many Chinese universities the statue of a man who did more to destroy higher education, and education at every level, than any other human being. A man who restricted academic freedom from the moment of the communist takeover, and a man whose words are now being studied again, as are the words of the current president, Mr. Xi, who seems in some way to model himself after Chairman Mao Zedong. That's a challenge that we'll discuss in Q&A, and why don't we stop the show right here and turn it over to you, John.
Great, thanks so much. Yeah, I think this, what is happening in China is on everybody's mind. Some of the questions that have come in and some that I formulate relate to this. But looking at your book, I wanted to ask a question related to rankings and global rankings, because you put a lot of stock in them about assessment to help us assess the overall quality of Chinese universities. Yet we also know that rankings, largely dependent on citation indexes, some reputational survey work, things that are kind of a narrow band of what research universities in the modern world do. And you also note some weaknesses in China's curriculum and teaching methods and the hiring of faculty, and there are reforms going on, and we're seeing significant things happen at places like Tsinghua University. So I guess my question is, how much should we rely on global rankings to really assess the quality of China's universities now and into the future?
If you ask deans and presidents how much they rely on global rankings, it really depends on where they rank. So Berkeley in that ranking is number 5 in the world, so you should feel great.
Well, it's that kind of stable group of institutions, I guess, except for Yale is not doing
except for Yale.
Depends on the survey. I mean, on the ranking.
But rankings measure only what can be ranked, or measure only what can be measured in some ways, and they're quite a bit all over the map. And there is no, it's an industry that begins only in the 1980s because of a failed news magazine. U.S. News and World Report finds another business, turns out to be a successful one, but now it is ubiquitous. I think what the rankings can tell you is nothing absolutely accurate. There's no one reason why Peking University is 2 spots above Tsinghua or vice versa. In this regard, but they show you something about the shifting tectonic plates of higher education, globally speaking, I think. And today there are 5 Chinese universities in that ranking in the top 50, but not very long ago there were none. And so the rise of China and Chinese universities and their presence in international scholarship, mostly measured by English language publications, interesting enough, in the sciences, is behind this shift in ranking. It doesn't measure mentorship, doesn't measure teaching in any serious way. Class doesn't, you do have faculty-student ratios that figure in, but on the whole, so many things that are so essential to an undergraduate education, separating that from a graduate education, absolutely essential also for graduate education, are not measured. And so we have to take them with a grain of salt, and yet they do help to motivate institutions to see how they can improve themselves in the world of research in particular, which is at the heart of the 2-century plus long goal of the modern research university.
How would you say the rankings in Chinese universities and most of universities throughout the world and in Asia, they really have strong efforts and put a lot of resources into STEM fields. But the social sciences and the humanities are kind of a different realm. How would you, rate, or what do you think the quality is of social sciences and humanities in these Chinese universities, the major, the top institutions?
Well, they're on the whole, because they don't publish as much in English, so they're less competitive in the global rankings in this regard. but you know, a lot of people read Chinese, and you know, in the studies of Chinese literature or Chinese philosophy, and so of course, the greatest work is happening in China, not outside of China, and also in the social sciences. The problem is that is particularly in the humanities and the social sciences, and in my own field, such as history, there are, as there are not, broadly speaking, in the sciences, political constraints. There are, according to the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party, 7 topics not to be talked about or taught about at a university. Things like constitutional government or early history of the Communist Party, many things that relate to the political world we live in today. And that sense of constraint, certainly in a field such as mine, is extraordinarily constraining. But, for example, you also have enormous strengths. You know, Renmin University, founded as the communist university, even before the founding of the People's Republic, has an extraordinary program in Chinese history. Maybe the best in the world in many ways, certainly for Qing history, for the last empire of China, from 1644 to the 20th century. So it is not to be underestimated.
Okay, so another question related to China.
Sure.
Since it is a major component of your book and its ascendancy as a world power in higher ed, you list a number of lessons, including governance and autonomy and academic freedom, as key components for high-quality universities. And so, you know, looking at Xi's evolving surveillance state, which includes the social credit system, and now Xi's solidification even further with the 20th National Congress now going on right now, and we've seen some elements of him definitely, you know, securing his power into the future. How have and will China's top universities, the C9 or the top grouping of Chinese universities, how have they and will they cope with this increasingly restrictive and insular political environment? How do they navigate that? And there are other lessons from perhaps the Mao era in this regard?
Well, unhappy ones from the Mao era, and things are nowhere like where they were then. But I think the first thing to say is that Chinese scholars, and here we go back far into history, have a long history of finding ways to express themselves even in periods of great repression. As often indirectly, often by historical analogy, but there are means of doing it. I would say that in modern times and more recent times, what can be said within the walls of a Chinese university or in a Chinese classroom is really much broader than most people think in the United States, and how people can express themselves. That space, however, appears to have shrunk very considerably, particularly over the last 2 or 3 years, where you have in-class monitors of what individuals are saying. You know, there always have been, in the communist systems, required courses in Marxism, Leninism, history, etc. And it used to be that individuals would have much greater freedom as to how to teach them. And that freedom seems also to have dissipated very significantly.
And they've increased the number of courses that are required, from what I understand.
Slightly.
With Xi thought now
well,
being an
of
important
course,
part of it.
of course. And I'm sure that we should have a course on it here coming up. But seriously, I would, so one has to worry about this, and yet the resilience, you know, when you think of how these universities, more than 130 years old, and the growth of extraordinary institutions, they survived the Qing dynasty, they survived the warlord period, they survived the nationalization of universities under the nationalists and the strengthening of them. They survived the Japanese invasion. They survived Mao and the Cultural Revolution. They will survive Xi Jinping as well.
Do you think there are things that we should be doing in let's say, the Western world of universities to help support our colleagues in China?
I think what we should do is to maintain our scholarly contacts and to deepen them, not to withdraw from China and not to fall victim to the state-to-state tension between the United States and China, which has many restrictions on all sides, many coming more from Washington than from Beijing. John Fairbank, who was my teacher one of my teachers in graduate school told me he regretted greatly, he had been educated at Tsinghua University in the 1930s, he regretted greatly the cutting off of academic relations between China and the United States from the 50s until the 70s. And his Chinese friends felt abandoned. At a great university like Berkeley, there are so many collaborative projects with Chinese scholars in the sciences, in engineering, as well as in the social sciences and humanities. This is the time not to step back, but to push forward, because as a great university, Berkeley has to engage in the fastest growing system of higher education in the world in quality, which is that in China, despite all of the political issues we're talking about.
And we're still so dependent, at least significantly dependent on international students from China as part of our graduate programs and these kinds of things.
And it's a good thing too, because graduate programs like Berkeley or Harvard, we choose people purely on the basis of merit, not where they're born, but purely on the basis of merit. And this is one reason why Chinese graduate students make up the majority of international, the largest number of international students from that of any other country, of any country.
Well, let's see. We hope that
because it's good for us.
Yes, absolutely, as part of our overall higher ed system, but the finances and other things. But I think that's what you said is pretty similar to how we should be approaching Russia or other parts of the world that are undergoing severe autocratic periods in their lives. So now turning to Hong Kong, it's increasingly similar political environment to the mainland China, and Hong Kong's universities have really developed significantly over the last several decades into high quality institutions, and based partly on their ability to bring and attract foreign talent. So I'm kind of interested in your view as to where Hong Kong universities are going to go. My sense is that we're seeing it's not necessarily a large number, but there are a lot of talented people leaving Hong Kong, just as we've seen an exodus from Russia in a certain period when they could get out. We're seeing talent leave these kinds of environments. So,
so the last case study in this book, as you know, is about the University of Hong Kong. And when I began this book, that was the case study that I thought, well, this is going to look at the greatest research university in China, broadly conceived, that is not under the Chinese Communist Party. But times change. It isn't yet under the Chinese Communist Party, but the national security law certainly casts a shadow over what can develop. And this has been a creeping set of interventions on the part of the Hong Kong government into the higher education system. And I saw this sadly firsthand in Hong Kong, sitting on the University Grants Committee there for about a decade, which very valiantly kept the government from interfering into the affairs of the 8 Hong Kong public universities. But seeing at the University of Hong Kong in particular, the flagship of that system, come under greater and greater political stress and interference from the former chief executive, and now with the setting up of it's not a martial law, but the national security law cannot be good news. And you do have a considerable, I would call it the beginning of an exodus of talent. And this is a great tragedy in a sense, because Hong Kong had the opportunity to be in a Hong Kong university. And it still could be, but it would take a political moving back on the part of the PRC. Asia's global university. Open, absolute freedom of speech in these universities, unencumbered in my experience, and English speaking, open to the world, as well as Cantonese speaking, but it's open to the world, and its path forward seems to me very murky indeed.
Well, one of the patterns that we see under illiberal democracies and autocratic governments is control of the governance structure of the institutions, and putting, in China they've demanded or put in more party members on the various boards, and you see that in Hong Kong as well. So, and that's one of your lessons.
Also in Florida.
Absolutely, Florida's, Yeah, that's an interesting case, definitely. But the governance structure seems to be changing significantly at these institutions, right? And that's a part of this pattern.
It's a complicated governance structure to begin with, back on mainland China,
Yeah.
where you have a party secretary and a president in parallel roles with, at the moment, the party secretary being deemed to be in a higher position. But China has had and does have some extraordinary party secretaries whose mission has been to promote the life of the university and to insulate the university from government to the degree possible. So it's not automatic. It's a complicated system to run at its best, and it takes extraordinary people to run it well.
Yeah, I think the one question would be, you said in the past tense it has been this way. I think the question is, what will it be like as we go into the next 10 years? Do you think there'll be stability, or is this going to, the crackdown on civil liberties and academic freedom seems significant. Do you think it'll halt at some point, or there'll be some shift or change?
I think what you can see if you look at any issue up close is how much and how far university presidents and often party secretaries go to protect and defend their faculty and their students from external intrusions, including from the party. So it isn't black and white in this regard. And the values of university presidents, and including most party secretaries whom I have met, are not, in terms of academic values, not far removed from that of many American university presidents or European chancellors. So I think we are all part of this same global system of universities, one learning from another, and a countercurrent. And the jury is still out as to how this will proceed. A countercurrent to the surveillance and repression that we see on political topics is the introduction in every major Chinese university of general education curricula, of curricula that are meant to promote independence of thought, of learning, to critical thinking, and they take it very seriously.
Yeah.
So there's a lot going on under the surface that is not so visible from the newspapers.
Yeah, so one of your case studies is Nanjing University, which has done many very innovative
Absolutely.
and different, and maybe this distance from Beijing is part of that dynamic.
Right.
You talk about
They might wish they were further still. So.
Well, I have one more China directly question that is from Brian Penbrass,
Great.
who's a colleague you know well, an associate here at the center. What is the future of U.S.-based branch campuses such as Duke Kunshan and NYU Shanghai in China? And you take a pretty Duke Kunshan is
Right.
a significant part of your case study. As China becomes more nationalistic and authoritarian, where do you think that's going to go? I think the one I would relate to that is you talk about the guarantees of academic freedom at Kunshan, the Duke,
Yep.
early in the development of this campus was a significant component to get Duke to buy in.
Right,
So
absolutely.
that's sort of the
Absolutely.
dynamic I think that Brian is pointing to.
So I would, knock on wood, of course, I would say that so far so good. Even under the terrible conditions of COVID and the shifting political landscape. It's clearly not a time in which such institutions will be expanding significantly in number. But they were, the gentleman who is now the party secretary of Peking University, one of the great universities of the world, Hao Ping, was vice minister of education for international relations, educational relations, and he oversaw the creation of so many of these joint venture universities and shepherded them and protected them, made them bureaucratically, whether it's NYU Shanghai, Duke Kunshan, the Schwarzman program at Tsinghua University. We have several British joint venture universities as well. And so far, so good. That is to say, the level of debate and engagement you can have, and I've spoken on very sensitive topics at Schwarzman College or at Kunshan, Duke Kunshan, I think would surprise most of our viewers today. They have unfettered internet. You have to think of them as, like Shenzhen is a special economic zone, think of them as special education zones. The aspiration, my guess, on the part of those in the Chinese government that helped to support them was that they would set standards in many areas that would be emulated by Chinese universities. That does not appear to be the case at the moment, but we shall see that,
Yeah.
great university like Wuhan University has been a strong partner and protector of Duke Kunshan.
Okay. So now I'm going to switch to a Berkeley question.
Yeah, good.
You note the possibility of Berkeley's greatness perhaps receding into being a myth at one point. I realize it was partly to make a point, related largely, if I read your chapter on this correctly, related to the declines in state funding and also what you call kind of a dysfunctional governance system. Ungovernable. And I think this is one thing that was really points to one aspect I really liked about your book, is that you use these you use historical discussions about various institutions in their past and then talk about their contemporary challenges that they're facing and these kinds of things. So this is a very nice way to look at things and informative. And you do that with Berkeley, but you basically do say that it is perhaps ungovernable. It's a hard word. And I think that related to somewhat to your period that you were here.
Yes, indeed.
And the things that were happening under President Dirks, at the time, Chancellor Dirks. But you point to the Academic Senate as well as part of kind of an obstructionist in trying to do innovative things. So I guess my question, and you use Berkeley as kind of a representative of a larger trend in public higher education in the United States, as perhaps in some form of decline in quality and productivity. So do you still hold that opinion about Berkeley, and then more generally about U.S. public higher education?
Well, I think the tensions that first of all, I was here at a time of great promise at the beginning of Chancellor Dirks' term and of great promise of innovation and reforms in undergraduate education, bringing a global campus here rather than building one overseas, and so on and so forth. So there was a great deal of excitement the first time that I was here. And the second time, it was all falling apart suddenly, seemingly suddenly, but building over the years, and I've seen this over many visits over several decades to this university, of just a greater and greater strain on faculty because of the financial difficulties, particularly after 2008, but very substantially, and wearing on what had been one of the great virtues, what still is one of the great virtues, the spirit and the public-minded spirit, and the spirit of democracy that you can see in departments in here, and how they are governed, for example, compared to my institution. And yet this really seemed to be strained to the breaking point. Big decisions had to be made on finance, on how to survive in a world in which the state was clearly privatizing the university, and yet the university had not prepared, and the faculty were not willing to help it prepare for a time and a future in which, like Michigan or like the University of Washington, it would have to fund 90% of its expenses by itself, rather than rely on the state support. Enormous resistance to this, and an enormous resistance to allowing the leadership to take what would have to be unpleasant decisions in order to do this. And I think Berkeley was injured by a governance structure that meant that, with the Board of Regents, this university has no board of its own. Not a surprise, but actually it's a weakness, in my view, to turn for its own governance. It's big enough university certainly to have that, but also an academic senate which has a great and historic reputation for what we might call academic insurgency, and yet made decision-making in this period of time extraordinarily difficult. An academic senate in which even emeriti, if I understand correctly, can take part, which is an unusual thing in American higher education. every chapter in this book is full of issues of governance. The Harvard Corporation comes in for a great deal of criticism, particularly in the first decade of the 21st century. But Berkeley was seriously challenged. I would say that Chancellor Christ has done an extraordinary job in her time of calming the waters, of working with the state in a time of greater economic growth, to be sure, still mainly taking on seemingly intractable issues that are truly Berkeley-centered, People's Park, and things of that. So showing great courage in doing so. But I worry that the kind of fundamental long-term challenges of the state's disinvestment in public higher education, particularly in its flagship institution, these are not ones that bode well for the long-term future. This university will do as well as any great public university in the United States. That is without question. But the whole world of public higher education in the United States is under great stress today.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yet, there is quality within those public institutions, and they're still producing the vast majority of engineers and probably
They
lawyers
graduate
too.
80% of our students.
Yeah, and so there's still overall quality, I think, in those institutions, but they are under stress.
No, they're extraordinary quality.
Yeah.
I mean, we compete, Harvard and Berkeley compete for the same faculty and the same graduate students. We're on the same, so what I would worry about for the entire American system, so the private universities may think that they're doing better at the moment because they have their more independent financing. But if the public universities decline, the privates will decline as well, because we compete for the same faculty, the same graduate students, and competition is at the heart of our collective excellence.
And is the concept that the competition is now global for talent? Is that what you're saying in part?
It is. It
Because
always has been to some degree, but it is now even, will be even more so.
I think about 28% of the faculty in the UC system have foreign visas.
Yeah.
It's something that people don't know, but then if you go to Europe, obviously, many of the Dutch universities and such have very high percentages.
Indeed.
But it is a global market out there. But the question is, are they going to go off and get jobs in China or in the Netherlands, or is it more of a domestic market for faculty?
What I'm looking at, I think what we're both looking at is if Berkeley has survived the great post-2008 crisis, and it now it's in a period of comparative stability. But the long-term issues that were pointed out by Chancellor Bergeneau, by Chancellor Dirks, and by Chancellor Christ, these have not gone away.
I just want to remind our audience that I'm open to getting some questions through chat. I don't see any on mine. Do you see any? So please submit your questions if you'd like to have them present selectively to Bill. So another question that we had previously was, what role did globalization play in the evolution of universities in the United States, Europe, and China? Broad question.
No, but obviously an important question. It's absolutely central. That is to say, universities were not invented in the United States. Harvard College, the oldest institution, begins as an academic and cultural backwater of Cambridge University in England, and it's a kind of a British college, not a real university despite the name, and not a serious research university until the founding of the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences on a German model in the 1860s. This university, founded in part by scholars from Yale, imbued with the German ideas of what a modern university ought to be, also has a global perspective really from the beginning. Or this university that's not very far from here, Stanford, I think the name. I can just remembering that name. Stanford, you know what the motto of Stanford is?
I've forgotten.
It's in German.
Oh, is it?
It's Die Luft der Freiheit weht.
Oh,
the wind of freedom blows.
Oh, I should know that.
And this is and if you look at the history of Chinese universities, Tsai Yuen-pei, the great chancellor of Peking University, received his doctorate in Germany, came to run that university in the 19 teens, and was a strong admirer of Humboldt, sought to imbue that university with what he saw as the leading models of universities of freedom of speech, freedom of learning and teaching, political diversity, and so on, even more so than, quite frankly, than the German universities at that time. So we are all part of learning one from another. What worries me today, actually, John, now that you mention it, and this is something that I and some colleagues back at Harvard are beginning to work on, we have, the United States, our universities are all on international models in origin, and today we look, you're a huge exception to this, very few individuals actually look abroad for new ideas. We think we have them all. We think we're number one.
Yes,
but if you
absolutely.
don't look to what the rest of the world is doing, you may not be number one for long.
I'd like to return or go to Germany, because that's what we look at the Free University of Berlin, and also Berlin, or Humboldt
University of Berlin, the Humboldt now.
And it seems like things are changing there fairly rapidly. That's at least my experience there. That the universities, obviously, they've got the Max Planck Institutes and other kinds of dynamic that produce a lot of academic work. But the German universities seem to be kind of turning a tide, partly through the excellence initiatives.
Yes.
Otherwise, I want you comment.
No, I
on that.
think you could see this in the two cases here in the German universities. One of them, Humboldt, which in many ways is much more ungovernable than Berkeley, since the fall of the Berlin Wall. As my predecessor as Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, Henry Rosowski, once said, his first rule of governance, university governance, was more democracy is not necessarily a good thing.
Yes, I read that.
That's a dean's
was
point
very
of view.
entertained by that comment.
But interestingly, like the Free University of Berlin, founded as an alternative type of university in the late 1940s, founded actually by students fleeing the East, then grows to be an extraordinary place, becomes a very radical place. I was a student at the Free University in the 1970s, and I took a seminar on Marx in a kind of a conference room about the size of the room that we're in right now, about 15 students, 6 different communist parties, very radical place. It has careened back and forth from being a massive university to today. It's an extraordinarily well-governed, focused university, extraordinary strength in the humanities and social sciences, and with its connection to Max Planck's also in certain areas of scientific endeavor. And part of the reason for its revival is the excellence initiative of forced competition for additional funding between the universities. Something that might not be a terrible idea for the UC system.
Yeah. Well,
but it will take more money.
Well, so I think this is something that we all have our eye on China, obviously, for many reasons, and it is an incredible story of growth and improvement in quality and research productivity in China. But we sometimes don't look over at Europe as much, or other places in which we should be looking, which are really sad stories, such as in Turkey and of course Russia as well. But in Europe, the Dutch universities are also extremely innovative, and I don't know if you have any. I know you're going to go to Utrecht in not too long a time. Any comments about the Dutch universities?
Utrecht was the first university to introduce, or how should we say, reintroduce a new form of liberal arts education into the modern research university in the form of the so-called, they're called university colleges. Mm-hmm. Small enclaves of students with a deep education in the liberal arts and sciences within the walls of a large research university. Amsterdam University College, was founded by our friend and colleague Marijk van der Wende, has just an extraordinary an altogether new institution, small and focused, with small classes focused on deep immersion into the liberal arts and sciences, but with all of the resources of two great research universities surrounding it. It's become a powerfully attractive model for students and parents from Germany, from Eastern Europe, from all over Europe and around the world, including, of course, from the Netherlands. And it is something that I think we might well want to experiment with here. Maybe an example of it, I don't know if it's a good example, it's certainly not an exact replica of this, is the Honors College, for example, at the University of Michigan.
Yeah, there are many honors colleges that have some aspects of that programmatic idea. So I want to return to the U.S. and the question is from a colleague from Cornell: what can U.S. universities do to maintain our status as a global leader in higher education? You've answered some of that, I think, a little bit, but more money?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that worries me a lot about the current rhetoric of international competition is that there have to be winners and losers. You know, the United States has to dominate in semiconductors, otherwise the world will end, and the Chinese can't be. You know, there can be multiple winners in the world of higher education. Ideally, there will be, but if it is a kind of a question of whether leadership is a comparative thing. If China rises to be the leading system of higher education in the world, it will depend in part on what happens here. Do we reinvest in our faculty and students? Do we expand the opportunity for higher education to a broader echelon of students? You know, we're pretty much flat in terms of enrollment ratios over the last several decades. How do we, you know, make it clear what is clearly a historical fact? These universities, University of California system, are powerful engines of economic growth. California today is not the California that we see without the University of California. It's simply not conceivable. And yet, the kind of politics of higher education and the fact that there appear to be no high-level political friends willing to speak out against it. It's an easy target to find. You can always find something you can criticize on a university campus. So you know, it's this. I think we have to get beyond rooting, if you're a citizen of Alabama, for the Crimson Tide, but also rooting for the University of Alabama, where your children will go and where you hope they will get an extraordinary, and they could get an extraordinary education if it were a better funded institution and better supported institution and perhaps a larger institution.
Yeah, and I think you know, one could also look across the pond, whichever pond you're on, for some innovative ideas. There are real problems with the German system of higher education. Their open enrollment structure creates a lot of, means that lots of students can be flooding into an institution without resources as well. They're dealing with some of that by basically weeding students out. It seems to be one pattern.
There's many problems.
But the Hochschulen, this concept of more of a technical institution, and the community colleges played that kind of role.
Yes.
Not quite to the degree where Hochschulens often have actual direct relationships with a specific industry in a region, or these kinds of things that are more coordinated with labor needs, perhaps. But that might be an area of reform in some form.
Right. I think, the great thing about American higher education is the diversity of institutions. You have quite different state structures in the realm of public universities, and in the private sector, the distinguishing feature, apart from football, the distinguishing feature of American higher education.
We should keep talking about that, because that has a big impact on Berkeley's finances. So,
but apart from football, the biggest distinguishing feature is the strength of liberal arts colleges, and actually, I would argue, the strength of the liberal arts in most of the great research universities of the United States.
Yeah.
And this vision that what Humboldt called the philosophical faculty, what we would call here the College of Arts and Letters, be at the heart of the university. It's surprising how strong that remains at the best universities in the United States.
Yes, absolutely. So, you offer various lessons, and I referred to one of them, or maybe tangentially to others. Can you kind of just say a little bit more about those lessons? Because here you took this effort to go through these case studies, and the theme partly is that China could be the kind of the next model for higher ed. That's one way of putting it, or biggest producer in research, or various other kinds of ways of evaluating success and productivity. But can you say a little bit more about what you thought you got out of doing these case studies?
Yeah, I think, China certainly has more of the best human capital of any country in the world from which to draw today, and a strong educational tradition from which to draw. So its capacity to lead can't be questioned. Its capacity to lead, its ability to lead will be perhaps another thing, but it can't lead alone. It is part of a global system of higher education, and that is the company that it wants to keep, and eventually, perhaps, to lead. If it's able to do so, it will be able to show that that these universities can be governed with a high degree of institutional autonomy. That's an open question. But governance is absolutely central to the success or failure of universities. Money will matter. Chinese universities today don't want for money, but the question really isn't how good you are when the money is flowing in, is how do you right the ship when it stops? And here there are many heroic stories in the Berkeley chapter, under Chancellor Birgeneau and under Chancellor Dirks, and then after that, right up to the present under Chancellor Chris, of how that is possible to do under greatly constrained circumstances. Third, of course, it goes without saying, the best faculty and the best students, so talent one has to continue to bring in, and with enormous ambition. And in an ideal, obviously, as a public university in a state, you have a duty to the taxpayers of the state to bring in primarily students from the state, but it's not the only responsibility that the university has. One thing that I discovered, which I hadn't really thought of so much, is that, of course, we think, just as we think of American history as in presidential terms, we think of universities in presidential or chancellorships. Under the chancellorship of Chancellor X or Y or Z, this happened. But the great universities also have what the Germans would call a Berufsbeamtentum, a professional civil service of people who serve over different presidential or chancellorship reigns, as it were, and who keep the lights on, who keep the institution moving forward in academic terms. There are two examples here who have exactly the same name. There is Peter Lange, the chancellor, as he's called, the Kanzler, basically chancellor of the exchequer, as it were, for the Free University of Berlin, who's an extraordinarily important figure in that university's revival. And Peter Lang, spelled exactly the same way, the long-term provost at Duke University, who does it's such an extraordinary job over several presidencies. And so the quality of individuals, we think, of course, people in the faculty always think it's the faculty that matter the most. And the faculty are not unimportant. But if you don't have working in the university individuals across the board, I see this Provost Breslauer during the financial crisis, the extraordinary work that he and his colleagues did, working across the board for the betterment of the institution. if you don't have that, people who share the academic values that the faculty share and work to accomplish them, then you will not have a successful institution.
You know, I think some people have pointed over time at UC campuses that they had that kind of internal culture that kept them going, and maybe it didn't really depend that much on who was chancellor. There's also an era, I think, when you know, chancellors are much more engaged in fundraising and these kinds of things as well. But I think it had that structural, you know, strength, shall we say, with various flaws. But you know, one other aspect I think that relates to governance and managing these institutions is scale. The size of the institutions now, you know, no elite private institution is more than roughly 20,000 students or something. And Harvard's 24, I think?
22.
22.
Yeah.
So the scale of these places have grown so much. At one time, there was a cap. You know, Berkeley was only supposed to be 28,000 students roughly, and that was out of the 1960 master planning. And the concept was things can get too big. There's not economy of scale. You lose culture. Anyway, that was all not based on analytical work, but just concept. But that issue of scale is really a significant component, don't you think, in terms of how you manage these places now?
Absolutely. And there's also a much greater demand because of federal requirements, legal fears, and so on. There, you know, the bureaucracies of the institutional bureaucracies of every leading university has grown substantially over time.
Yeah.
Not simply because, you know, by design, that is to say, but almost by necessity, in order to deal with the multiple issues that emerge. And that, of course, is, you know, if you want faculty to get together to agree on anything, is that wherever you are, the administration is too big. Even in places where it's actually very small, such as Harvard in comparison. So it's a, you know, one of the, I guess, if you look at this, as you were speaking, I was thinking, well, you know, the leading private universities in the United States have not grown much.
Yes.
The demand for them has grown.
And they like that.
Yes, but is it a good idea? No one has the courage to think of a greater expansion rather than to maintain, simply because by remaining small you remain elitist no matter what, maintaining this.
Well, there have been a group of academics, including our former dean of the Coleman School of Public Policy, Henry Brady, who have yelled quite loudly that Stanford should grow more to help deal with the demand and labor needs of the state, but that's not going to happen.
Well, they certainly have the land on which to grow.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, the other part about scale is that it relates to the budget side. It's growing without the resources that we once had. Now, we should kind of qualify that because the places like the University of California overall and Berkeley are bringing in a lot of federal money now.
Yes.
Even more so. So that comes into the equation that changes a little bit the dynamic of what is public and what's not. But is student-to-faculty ratios, you know, at one point there was some parity related to the elite privates with the publics. I mean, we're talking decades ago, but now it's just so different. You know, Harvard may be 8-1 or something, and Berkeley, depending on how you count the numbers, is 24 to
Right. Those numbers,
25. Yeah, they get a little squishy, but it's more or less an observation that that's a difficulty. The thing I want to say as we get close to the end of our session is to talk a little bit about also the difference between in the U.S. we have a U.S. Department of Education and it does certain kinds of things, and the states are the major player, but we have nothing like a Ministry of Education. We don't have that governance structure to look at. Do you have any observations about that? You know, I think a common complaint if you're visiting colleagues in various parts of the world, maybe not China, but is complaining about the ministry, or in the UK, you know, when the Young Turks, who was in the Department of Transportation, then becomes a head of budgeting for all of higher ed, or some version of that. Any observations about that difference?
You know, people love ministries of education when they are full of money and without rules, but that almost never happens. And so you have, you know, certain systems, highly centralized ones like in France or in China, that can be very, very productive and very constraining at the same time. I think, on the whole, the United States, we worry about not being able to compete with these more centralized systems. We worry, as we were, in some industries, of not having an industrial policy. In this case, an academic industrial policy. But I think, on the whole, we are better served by our federalist structure. The federal government does support research and education in a wide variety of ways, but the fact that you have the public universities ideally competing one with another for students and faculty, the fact that you have the private universities offering something different, in many cases offering something different for less, if it's for people of lower income, for the elite private universities, it's an extraordinarily vibrant system still today. It needs to recognize, however, that, and here is the key takeaway for me, if the public sector declines, we all go down. And it is the lack of public-mindedness about the central importance of public universities in the United States that is, I think, our greatest danger.
Okay, well, with that, I think we've come to the end of our session. Now, Bill, you can get this book in hardback, not out in paperback for a period, I
Yeah,
take it?
not yet, anyway.
And it is available online?
It's available online at Amazon or Harvard University Press.
Okay.
And a very a great Christmas gift, I would say.
Well, again, congratulations on the book, and Empires of Ideas is available online. Thank you so much, Bill.
Thank you, John.